I didn't plan for it to happen. The barn was quiet, the air thick with unspoken tension. Daniel's gaze lingered. His voice dropped, and suddenly the lines between us blurred until they disappeared. In that fleeting, heated moment, everything changed. His touch, hesitant yet electric, awakened something I wasn't ready to confront. Now, I'm left with the memory of that night. His voice, his eyes, the way it all felt inevitable. The barn wasn't just a place. It was the moment everything I thought I knew unraveled. And I can't stop wondering what happens next. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The air was different here as it always had been. Crisp, clean, tinged with the scent of hay and earth that no city could ever replicate. As I stepped out of the car, the familiar weight of nostalgia settled over me. This was the farm Grandma Evelyn and Grandpa Walter's sanctuary, a place where my childhood summers had unfurled like endless, sun-dappled tapestries. I took a deep breath, letting the aroma of freshly tilled soil and wildflowers settle in my lungs. The chirping of crickets blended with the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Everything here felt timeless, like a photograph frozen in perpetual golden light. The house came into view as I rounded the gravel path. A two-story farmhouse with whitewashed walls, a slanted roof, and a wraparound porch that creaked with every step. My grandparents had lived here for as long as I could remember, their lives woven into the land they cherished. A soft smile tugged at my lips as memories flickered to life. Chasing fireflies in the meadow, sneaking cookies from Evelyn's kitchen, and spending lazy afternoons in the barn with Walter, watching him mend tools while telling stories of a simpler time. Yet, as comforting as this place was, an odd sense of apprehension nudged at the edges of my mind. I dismissed it, blaming the long drive and my overactive imagination. Still, I couldn't quite shake the memory of Daniel's gaze the last time I'd been here. Uncle Daniel had always been something of an enigma, charming yet distant, with a quiet intensity that was hard to pin down. I remembered catching his eyes on me during a family barbecue years ago, a fleeting moment that had left me inexplicably uneasy. But surely that was nothing. He was my uncle, after all. Pushing the thought aside, I let my focus return to the setting around me. The barn stood off to the side, its red paint weathered but resilient. The field stretched endlessly, a patchwork of green and gold under the late afternoon sun. The old oak tree still stood tall near the pond, its branches sprawling like welcoming arms. Stepping onto the porch, I hesitated before knocking on the familiar wooden door. It swung open almost immediately, and there she was, Grandma Evelyn, with her silver hair pinned back and her apron dusted with flour. Her face lit up when she saw me, and before I could say a word, I was wrapped in a warm, floral-scented hug. "Alex! Oh, it's been far too long, darling," she exclaimed, pulling back to look me over. "You've grown up so much. You look wonderful." "Thanks, Grandma," I said, smiling. "It's good to be back." "Walter," she called over her shoulder. "Alex is here." Grandpa Walter appeared a moment later, his weathered face breaking into a grin as he hugged me in his strong arms. "Welcome home, kiddo." Home. That word stirred something in me, a mix of comfort and melancholy. This place was home, yet it wasn't, not really. I'd outgrown it in some ways, but a part of me still clung to its simplicity, its charm. As I settled into the kitchen, Evelyn busied herself preparing tea while Walter asked about my drive. Their questions and laughter filled the air, washing away the lingering tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. It wasn't until later, as I sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, that I noticed Daniel's truck pulling into the driveway. My chest tightened, and I told myself it was nothing, just old nerves. When he stepped out, he looked different than I remembered. He was leaner, his face lined in a way that suggested more than just age, experience perhaps, or weariness. His dark hair was shorter now, flecked with hints of silver, and his jeans and flannel shirt fit snugly, emphasizing a rugged build. I waved, and he hesitated before waving back, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction longer than felt comfortable. Something unspoken lingered in that glance, but before I could dwell on it, he turned and grabbed a duffel bag from the truck. Dinner that night was lively, the dining table crowded with Evelyn's home-cooked dishes. Daniel was quieter than I expected, though his rare comments drew laughter from the table. I noticed the way his gaze occasionally flicked toward me, and I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it. As the evening wound down, I excused myself and stepped outside, needing fresh air. The stars were scattered across the sky, brighter and more plentiful than they ever were back home. I closed my eyes, letting the calm of the countryside wash over me. But even as I breathed in the stillness, a shiver ran down my spine, a faint but persistent reminder of Daniel's gaze. The morning sun streamed through the sheer curtains of the guest room, waking me with its gentle warmth. It was a far cry from the blaring alarm clocks and muted city light I was used to. For a moment, I just lay there, soaking in the quiet hum of the farm, the faint crow of a rooster, the occasional lowing of cattle, and the rhythmic clink of dishes coming from the kitchen downstairs. I dressed quickly, tugging on jeans and a sweater before heading down. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and bacon filled the air as I entered the kitchen. Grandma Evelyn stood at the stove, humming softly, while Grandpa Walter read the morning paper at the table. "Good morning, sweetheart," Evelyn said, her voice as warm as the sunlight pouring in. "Did you sleep well?" "Like a rock," I replied, grabbing a cup of coffee and sitting across from Walter. "Good, good. We've got pancakes coming up," she said, flipping one deftly in the pan. The kitchen door creaked open, and Daniel walked in, freshly showered, his hair damp and sticking to his forehead. His presence seemed to shrink the space in the room. He nodded at everyone, his eyes briefly meeting mine before he looked away. "Morning," he said in a low voice. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone casual. He grabbed a mug and poured himself coffee, standing at the counter as if he preferred to keep his distance. I noticed the way his shoulders tensed slightly, like he wasn't entirely at ease. His movements were deliberate, calculated, almost as he stirred sugar into his coffee. Breakfast passed in a haze of chatter and laughter, Evelyn and Walter catching me up on farm news and local gossip. Daniel contributed little, but when he spoke, his deep voice drew everyone's attention. Afterward, Walter and Evelyn busied themselves with morning chores, leaving Daniel and me alone in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his coffee forgotten on the table. "So, how's the city treating you?" he asked, breaking the silence. "It's busy," I said, unsure how much detail he wanted. "Loud. Nothing like this." He nodded, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Figured as much. Hard to beat the quiet out here." There was a pause, not uncomfortable but weighted somehow, like the air had thickened. His eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary before he turned away, grabbing his coffee and heading outside without another word. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The day passed quickly, filled with the kind of simple tasks that felt refreshing in their familiarity. Evelyn showed me how her vegetable garden had expanded, the neat rows of tomatoes and peppers thriving under her care. Walter took me out to check the fences, his steady voice explaining how the cattle had started roaming farther than usual. It wasn't until later in the afternoon that I saw Daniel again. I'd wandered into the barn, drawn by the earthy smell of hay and wood. The space was dimly lit, beams of sunlight cutting through the gaps in the walls and creating a lattice of golden light on the floor. Daniel was there, tinkering with a piece of farm equipment. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, tanned forearms smudged with grease. He didn't notice me at first, his focus entirely on the task in front of him. "Hey," I said, stepping inside. He glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Hey, what's wrong with it?" I asked, nodding toward the machine. "Just old. Needs a little patience to get it running again." I hovered near the door, unsure if I should stay or leave. Something about being alone with him felt complicated. Come here, he said, nodding toward the equipment. I'll show you. Reluctantly, I stepped closer, watching as he explained the parts and their functions. His voice was steady, his words precise, and for a moment, I forgot about the strange tension. You've got a knack for this stuff, I said, trying to fill the silence. He shrugged. You grow up on a farm, you learn to fix things. There was something about the way he said it, gruff but tinged with an unexpected softness. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, it felt like the world outside the barn disappeared. I wasn't sure what I saw in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps, or something deeper, but it left me unsettled. You should get back before Evelyn wonders where you are, he said finally, breaking the moment. Yeah, I murmured, turning to leave. As I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun warming my face, I couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's gaze followed me long after I'd walked away. The next few days on the farm blurred together in a comfortable rhythm. Mornings began with the scent of bacon frying and Evelyn's cheery greetings. Afternoons were spent wandering the fields or helping with small chores, and evenings were filled with the soft hum of crickets and the occasional coyote howl. The peaceful simplicity was a stark contrast to the noise and rush of my usual life, but I welcomed it. And yet, beneath the surface, a strange tension lingered. It wasn't just the way Daniel's presence seemed to fill the room even when he said little. It was the way he always seemed to be nearby, as though our paths crossed too conveniently. His gaze, when I caught it, lingered a fraction longer than necessary. His touches, light brushes of his hand when passing a tool or helping me lift something, felt deliberate, even if they were casual enough to pass unnoticed by anyone else. It unsettled me. It intrigued me. On the third day, I joined Daniel in the barn again. This time, I wasn't drawn there by chance. I went deliberately, curious to understand him better, or perhaps to understand the pull I felt when he was near. He was repairing an old saddle when I walked in, the scent of leather and oil filling the air. He didn't look up at first, his hands deftly working with the tools, but he acknowledged me with a low, "Hey, hey," I replied, stepping closer. "Need help with anything?" He glanced up then, a smirk playing on his lips. "You know anything about saddles?" "Not a clue," I admitted, leaning against a nearby post. "Didn't think so," he said, his tone teasing. "But you can keep me company if you want." I stayed, watching him work in the dim, golden light of the barn. His movements were confident, precise, and I found myself studying him in ways I hadn't before. The way his brow furrowed in concentration, the slight curve of his mouth when he was focused. "You don't talk much," I said after a while. He glanced at me, his smirk fading into something softer. "Not much to say, I guess." "I don't believe that," I said, tilting my head. "You're just careful about what you say." He chuckled, the sound low and rough. "Maybe." There was a pause, a moment where the only sounds were the creak of the barn and the rustling of hay. "You've changed," he said suddenly, catching me off guard. "What do you mean?" "You're different than I remember. More confident, self-assured." His eyes met mine, and the weight of his gaze sent a shiver down my spine. "People change," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, but there was something unreadable in his expression, something that made me feel exposed. Later that evening, Evelyn asked me to help her with the garden. As we worked, she filled the air with stories about the neighbors and updates on the farm. Her chatter was soothing, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. "Daniel seems quieter than usual," I said, trying to sound casual. Evelyn paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's had a rough year. The divorce took a toll on him." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Divorce was a distant concept to me, something that happened to other people. But as I thought about it, it made sense. Daniel's quiet intensity, his guarded demeanor. He wasn't just reserved. He was carrying something. "Give him time," Evelyn said, patting my arm. "He's a good man, but he's been through a lot." Her words stuck with me as the sun dipped below the horizon and the farm was bathed in soft twilight. That night, the family gathered on the porch after dinner. Walter puffed on his pipe while Evelyn knitted, and Daniel and I sat silently, the warm summer air wrapping around us like a blanket. "Tomorrow we'll need to check the east fence," Walter said. "Cows have been wandering too close to the woods." "I'll take Alex with me," Daniel offered, his voice even. My stomach flipped at the suggestion, though I couldn't explain why. "Good idea," Walter said. "You two can handle it." The next morning, Daniel and I set out early. The air was cool, the grass wet with dew as we made our way toward the eastern boundary of the farm. He carried a toolbox, and I followed close behind, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. When we reached the fence, Daniel began inspecting the posts, pointing out areas where repairs were needed. I watched him work, his movements efficient and practiced. "Here," he said, handing me a hammer. "You can fix this one." I took the tool, my hands brushing his briefly. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a spark up my arm. As I hammered the nails into place, I felt his eyes on me, watching, not just observing my work, but studying me. When I looked up, his gaze didn't waver, and something unspoken passed between us. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing. That evening, as I lay in bed, my thoughts were a tangled mess. Daniel's presence lingered in my mind, the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his proximity. I tried to dismiss it as nothing, as a byproduct of spending too much time together, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. And it scared me. The bar wasn't what I expected. Nestled off a winding country road, it looked like something out of a faded postcard. A weathered wooden building with neon beer signs glowing faintly in the windows. The gravel parking lot was half full, mostly with trucks, their dusty exteriors a testament to long days of work. Daniel pulled his truck into a spot near the entrance and cut the engine. The faint hum of music spilled out as he opened his door, and I hesitated before following him inside. "Relax," he said, glancing back at me. "It's just a bar." The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of spilled beer and old wood. A jukebox in the corner played a twangy country tune, and the patrons, mostly older men in flannel shirts and work boots, nursed their drinks or played pool. It was a world away from the polished, trendy bars I was used to in the city. Daniel led the way to a small table near the back, nodding at a few familiar faces as we passed. He slid into a chair, and I sat across from him, feeling oddly out of place. "What's your poison?" he asked, his voice low but teasing. Beer, I guess?" I said, unsure of the right answer. He raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, heading to the bar to place our order. When he returned, he set a cold bottle in front of me and leaned back in his chair, his own drink held loosely in his hand. We sat in silence for a while, the sound of clinking glasses and quiet laughter filling the gaps between us. I sipped my beer, trying to relax, but I was hyper-aware of Daniel's presence. His calm, steady gaze, the way he seemed so at ease in this environment. "You're not much of a drinker, are you?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Not really," I admitted, tracing a finger along the condensation on my bottle. "Figured as much," he said with a smirk. "You don't seem like the type." "What's that supposed to mean?" I shot back, more defensive than I intended. He chuckled, a low sound that sent a strange warmth through me. "Nothing bad, just different. You don't fit in here." I frowned, unsure whether to take that as a compliment or an insult. "And you do. More than you," he said, his smirk softening into something almost playful. The banter surprised me. Daniel had been so guarded on the farm, his words measured and careful, but here he seemed more relaxed, even teasing. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted. The bar filled up with more patrons, their laughter and chatter growing louder, but our little corner remained private, insulated by the growing crowd. "Do you ever feel trapped?" I asked suddenly, surprising even myself. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Trapped how? By this place. By everything. I gestured vaguely around us, trying to put my thoughts into words. It feels so small, like the rest of the world doesn't exist. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Sometimes, but it's not the place that traps you. It's the people, the expectations. I blinked, caught off guard by the intensity of his response. What do you mean? He took a long sip of his drink, his gaze distant. People want you to fit into a box, be what they expect you to be. When you don't, they push back. There was a weight to his words, a raw honesty that made my chest tighten. Is that what happened with your marriage? I asked softly, unsure if I was overstepping. His eyes snapped back to mine, and for a moment, I thought he might brush the question off. But then he nodded. Part of it. She wanted something I couldn't be. Someone I couldn't be. I didn't know what to say. There was a vulnerability in his voice, one I hadn't heard before, and it left me feeling exposed, like he'd opened a door and was daring me to step through. The conversation shifted again after that, becoming lighter, more playful. He told me stories about the people in the bar. The pool players who always cheated, the bartender who knew everyone's secrets, and I found myself laughing, the tension between us easing. But as the night wore on and the drinks flowed, the teasing took on a different edge. You're not like the others, he said, his voice quieter now, the playful smirk replaced with something more serious. What do you mean? You don't belong here. Not really. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, the rest of the bar seemed to fade away. I don't know if that's a compliment or not, I said, my voice unsteady. It is, he said simply. There was a pause, the air between us thick with something unspoken. His gaze lingered, and I felt my pulse quicken under the weight of it. Daniel, come on, he said suddenly, standing and tossing a few bills on the table. Let's get out of here. The drive back to the farm was quiet, the tension from the bar lingering like an unspoken question. The fields stretched out on either side of the road, bathed in moonlight, and I found myself stealing glances at Daniel in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. When we pulled into the driveway, he cut the engine but didn't move to get out. You good? He asked, his voice low. Yeah, I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he opened the door and stepped out. I followed him toward the barn, the cool night air prickling my skin. The barn loomed in the quiet darkness, its weathered exterior bathed in faint moonlight. The cool night air carried the faint scent of hay and earth, mingling with the distant hum of crickets. Daniel walked ahead of me, his silhouette cutting a path toward the entrance, and I followed silently, my heart pounding in my chest for reasons I didn't fully understand. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the rich smell of wood and animals. Dust motes floated in the beams of moonlight streaming through the gaps in the walls, and the dim glow gave the space an almost otherworldly feel. Daniel stopped near the center of the barn, turning to face me. He leaned against a stack of hay bales, his expression unreadable as he folded his arms across his chest. You all right? He asked, his voice low and steady. Yeah, I said quickly, though my pulse betrayed me, hammering in my ears. He tilted his head, studying me with a gaze that felt impossibly heavy. You sure? You've been quiet since we left the bar. I'm fine, he insisted, though the words felt hollow. He didn't push further, but his eyes didn't leave mine. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged, until I felt like I couldn't breathe. What are we doing out here? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, the motion slow and deliberate. Figured you could use some air. Clear your head. I laughed softly, the sound more nervous than amused. My head's fine. Is it? He asked, his tone calm but probing. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. There was something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, that made it impossible to lie. I don't know. I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Daniel pushed off the hay bales, taking a step closer. The air between us seemed to ripple with tension, and I instinctively took a step back, my spine pressing against the wooden post behind me. "You're overthinking," he said quietly, his voice closer now. "I'm not," I protested weakly, though even I didn't believe it. He stopped just short of me, his presence overwhelming. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, the world outside the barn ceased to exist. "Alex," he said, my name a low murmur that sent a shiver through me. "You don't have to figure it out right now." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to breathe. "Figure what out?" His gaze dropped briefly, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face before he met my eyes again. "Whatever it is that's got you so twisted up." I wanted to respond, to say something that would fill the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood frozen, every nerve in my body alive with a mix of nervousness and something else, something I couldn't name. When his hand brushed mine, the touch was so light I almost thought I imagined it. But it was real, and it sent a spark up my arm that left my skin tingling. "You're shaking," he said softly. "I'm not," I whispered, though my voice betrayed me, trembling just as much as my hands. "Alex." There was something in the way he said my name, gentle but firm, grounding but unsettling, that made me look up at him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held an intensity that made my knees weak. "You're thinking too much," he said again, his voice impossibly calm. "I can't help it," I admitted, my words barely audible. He took another step closer, his hand brushing mine again, this time lingering. Then stop. I didn't know who moved first, if it was him or if it was me. All I knew was that suddenly the space between us was gone, his hand resting lightly on my arm, his warmth seeping through the thin fabric of my sweater. My breath hitched as he leaned in, his voice a low murmur in my ear. "Tell me to stop." Couldn't. The words wouldn't come, caught somewhere in the whirlwind of emotions crashing through me. The moment stretched endlessly, a delicate balance teetering on the edge of something I couldn't define. "Alex," he said again, pulling back just enough to meet my eyes. "You okay?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The barn seemed to hold its breath, the silence wrapping around us like a cocoon. The dim light softened everything, blurring the edges of the world until all that existed was this moment, this space, and the unspoken tension that bound us. When his hand cupped my cheek, the warmth of his palm sent a shiver down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to pull away, to step back and break whatever was happening. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. Instead, I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me, unsure where it would lead but unable to stop it. When it was over, the barn seemed to exhale, the tension dissipating like smoke. Daniel stepped back, his expression unreadable as he ran a hand through his hair. "You should go," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the spot. "Alex," he said, his tone firmer now. "Go." Something in his voice left no room for argument, and I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As I stepped out of the barn and into the cool night air, my thoughts swirled in a chaotic mess. Guilt, confusion, curiosity. They all churned inside me, a storm I couldn't escape. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The next morning came too quickly, the sunlight streaming through the curtains pulling me from a restless sleep. My mind was a haze, fragments of the night before flitting through my thoughts like ghosts I couldn't banish. The barn. The touch of Daniel's hand. His voice, low and steady, cutting through the charged silence. I sat up in bed, rubbing my temples as a wave of guilt and confusion washed over me. The events of the night felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't quite shake. But it hadn't been a dream. The mirror above the dresser caught my eye, and I stared at my reflection as if searching for answers in my own face. I looked the same as I always had, yet something felt different, as if the night had shifted something inside me I couldn't put back. The kitchen was quiet when I finally ventured downstairs. Evelyn was outside hanging laundry, and Walter had already gone to town for supplies. Daniel sat at the table, a mug of coffee in his hand. I hesitated in the doorway, my chest tightening at the sight of him. He looked up when he heard me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered for a moment before he turned back to his coffee. "Morning," he said, his voice even. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral as I poured myself a cup of coffee. I sat across from him, the silence between us thick and heavy. I avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the steam rising from my cup. "Busy day ahead," he said after a while, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I replied, though I had no idea what the day's plans were. He nodded, his eyes scanning the table as if searching for something to say. But no words came, and the silence returned, oppressive and unyielding. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I threw myself into helping Evelyn with chores, desperate for distraction. We harvested vegetables from the garden, folded laundry, and baked bread, the steady rhythm of the tasks soothing in its simplicity. But no matter how busy I kept myself, my thoughts kept drifting back to the barn. I replayed the night in my head, over and over, trying to make sense of it. Every glance, every touch, every word felt burned into my memory, and the weight of it all pressed down on me like a physical thing. What had it meant? What did it say about me? About him? That evening, dinner was quieter than usual. Evelyn and Walter chatted about the farm, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. I picked at my food, my appetite long gone, and Daniel barely said a word. When the meal was over, I excused myself and stepped outside, the cool night air a welcome relief. The stars were out again, scattered across the sky like tiny diamonds, and I found myself drawn to the porch swing. I sat there for a long time, the creak of the swing the only sound breaking the silence. My thoughts churned, a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. What was I supposed to do now? Pretend nothing had happened? Act like the barn was just another memory to file away? The creak of the screen door startled me, and I looked up to see Daniel stepping out onto the porch. He paused when he saw me, his hand on the doorframe, before stepping closer. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted finally. He nodded, leaning against the railing, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the fields. "Me neither." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment, the tension between us eased. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer right away, his brow furrowed as he thought. "We go back to normal," he said eventually, though his tone made it clear he wasn't convinced. "Can we?" I asked, my voice wavering. He looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "We have to." I nodded, though the words felt hollow. The next few days passed in a strange, unspoken truce. Daniel and I avoided being alone together, our interactions limited to polite exchanges and quick glances. Evelyn and Walter didn't seem to notice anything amiss, their days as steady and predictable as ever. But I couldn't stop thinking about the barn, about the moment we'd shared and the questions it had left behind. Late one night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized I wasn't ready to let it go. The guilt and confusion were still there, gnawing at me, but so was something else. Something I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. And as I closed my eyes, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. The farm seemed quieter in the days that followed, though nothing outwardly had changed. Evelyn still bustled around the kitchen with her endless energy. Walter remained a steadfast presence in the fields, and Daniel kept himself busy with repairs and routine chores. But for me, everything felt different. It wasn't just what had happened in the barn. It was what it had awakened in me. A sense of vulnerability and curiosity I hadn't felt before. Questions about boundaries, choices, and who I was. The days took on a strange rhythm, the moments blurring together, marked by small, almost imperceptible shifts. I began to notice the silence in new ways. On the surface, it was peaceful, crickets chirping in the fields, the distant low of cattle. But beneath it, there was something else. A tension, a sense of things left unsaid. Daniel and I had fallen into a pattern of avoidance, neither of us willing to address the undercurrent that lingered between us. When we crossed paths, our exchanges were polite, even mundane. But the weight of what wasn't spoken hung in the air, heavy and palpable. I often found myself drawn to the barn, though I avoided going inside. It had become a symbol in my mind, a place of secrets, of boundaries crossed, of desires and fears I didn't fully understand. One afternoon, while helping Walter in the fields, he spoke of the barn in a way that startled me. "That old place has seen its share of stories," he said, chuckling as he leaned against a fence post. "Stories?" I asked, my voice hesitant. "Oh, sure," he said, his tone light. "First dates, secret hideouts, even a marriage proposal or two. It's a quiet spot. Makes people think." His words stayed with me long after we returned to the house. The barn wasn't just a place. It was a symbol, a repository of moments that shaped the people who came through it. And now it was part of my story, too. That evening, I found myself sitting by the pond under the oak tree, the water shimmering in the soft glow of the setting sun. It was one of my favorite spots on the farm, a place where I could breathe and let my thoughts settle. I traced patterns in the dirt with a stick, my mind turning over the past few days. The barn, the silence, the tension. They were all pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. Was it curiosity that had drawn me to Daniel? Or something deeper, something I wasn't ready to confront? And what about him? His quiet intensity, his guarded words. What did they mean? As I sat there, I realized I wasn't just wrestling with my feelings for Daniel. I was wrestling with myself, with my choices, my boundaries, and what it meant to challenge them. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain pattering against the window. The world outside was cloaked in gray, the fields shimmering with droplets. It was the kind of day that slowed everything down, forcing reflection and stillness. I found Daniel in the barn, fixing a loose board on one of the stalls. He didn't look up as I entered, but he must have sensed my presence because he spoke. "Morning," he said, his voice even. "Morning," I replied, stepping closer. For a moment, we worked in silence, the sound of the rain on the roof filling the space. "I've been thinking," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He paused, his hands stilling on the board, but he didn't look at me. "Yeah, about what happened, about us." His shoulders tensed slightly, and I felt a pang of guilt for bringing it up. But I couldn't keep the words bottled up any longer. "I don't know what it meant," I admitted, "but I know it mattered. To me, at least." He exhaled slowly, finally turning to face me. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark and searching. "It mattered," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean it was right." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "I know." For a long moment, we stood there, the unspoken tension between us palpable. The barn seemed to hold its breath, the weight of our words settling like dust in the still air. As I left the barn, I felt a strange sense of clarity. What had happened couldn't be undone, but it had shaped me, pushed me to question who I was and what I wanted. The barn remained a symbol, a place of secrets and self-discovery, of boundaries crossed and consequences faced. And as I walked back to the house, the rain soaking into the earth beneath my feet, I realized that the story wasn't just about Daniel or the barn. It was about me.